If you've ever wondered what it takes to build a successful book coaching business, listen up. Author Accelerator just published an ebook that takes you behind the scenes of my book coaching journey to give you a sneak peek into how I started and grew my business. And if you grab a copy today, you'll get an extra special invite to listen in on a conversation between myself and Jenny Nash, the CEO of Author Accelerator, for all the juicy details on Tuesday, June 11th. To grab this free ebook and get a behind-the-scenes look at what it takes to build a successful coaching business, go to savannahgilbo.com/coach. People are products of their past, and if we want our characters to come across as authentic and believable, then we need to understand their backstories. Wounds in particular damage a character's self-worth, they change how they view the world, they can cause trust issues, and they can dictate how that character will interact with other people. All of this can make it harder for them to achieve specific goals, and it can make it easier for you to create meaningful conflict for them to face as they pursue those goals. Welcome to the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. My name is Savannah Gilbo, and I'm here to help you write a story that works. I want to prove to you that writing a novel doesn't have to be overwhelming. So each week, I'll bring you a brand new episode with simple, actionable, and step-by-step strategies that you can implement in your writing right away. So whether you're brand new to writing or more of a seasoned author looking to improve your craft, this podcast is for you. So pick up a pen and let's get started. In today's episode, we're going to talk about developing character backstory, including the 3 ingredients you can and should develop when it comes to backstory. But before we dive into all the juicy details, let's make sure we're on the same page about what I mean by backstory. So what is backstory? Well, to put it simply, backstory is everything that has happened before your story starts on page 1. And it's going to influence everything that happens in your story, from the plot events to your characters' motivations to your ability to manage your thematic subtext. And if you're thinking that sounds like it's something really important, then you are correct. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this topic today, because I do think there are a lot of great resources out there about, how to find your character's inner obstacle or that wound that that they've carried with them since they were young, or whatever piece of backstory, or, things like that. But I think there's also a way that we can look at developing backstory in a more organic sense. And like I said, we're going to talk about the 3 key pieces of character backstory to develop. And by focusing on each one of those and how each one of those things works together with the other 2 things, that leads you to developing backstory in a really nice and organic way. So we're going to dig into all of that. But first, a question I get asked all the time is something like, when do I worry about developing backstory? And like most things in writing, the answer is it depends. You can really work on character backstory anytime you want, depending on what works best for you in your writing practice. So sometimes writers will start brainstorming a character's background before they have a fully formed plot, and this works well for them. Other writers might go back and flesh out a really good and in-depth backstory for a character after they've finished their first draft. So there's no right or wrong way to go about this. Personally, for me, I like to flesh out as much of a character's backstory as I can before I write the first draft, just because backstory can and does inform so much of the story. So that's what works for me in my process. And then one last thing before we dive in, I want to mention that I have another episode on character backstory. So it's episode number 14 called How to Handle Character Backstory in Your Novel. If you haven't heard that episode yet, it will pair very nicely with today's episode. So this episode that you're currently listening to is about how to develop your character's backstory, and then episode 14 is about how to write backstory in your novel. So how to weave it into the present and, not go too overboard with too much backstory or too much info dumping or things like that. Okay, so we will put the link to that episode in the show notes for you. And now let's dive into how to brainstorm and develop your character's backstory. And like I hinted at earlier, there are 3 key ingredients that you will want to flesh out. So the first one is a wound, the second one is an inner obstacle, and the third one is your character's current behavior and motivations. So one more time, those 3 ingredients were a wound, inner obstacle, and your character's current behavior and motivations. All right, so let's dig into how to uncover your character's wound first. So what is a wound? Well, a wound is the result of something that has happened in your character's past that has caused psychological or emotional pain and the very strong belief that that thing could happen again. Okay, so it's something that happened in the past that has given rise to a specific fear. And the key word there is specific. So we really want to drill down into, okay, this happened to my character in the past. It caused psychological and or emotional pain. Because of that, my character believes it could happen again, and this is specifically what they're afraid of. Now, this is important because people are products of their past, and if we want our characters to come across as authentic and believable, then we need to understand their backstories. Wounds in particular damage a character's self-worth, they change how they view the world, they can cause trust issues, and they can dictate how that character will interact with other people. All of this can make it harder for them to achieve specific goals, and it can make it easier for you to create meaningful conflict for them to face as they pursue those goals. So when you're thinking about how to uncover your character's wound, think about traumatic events that might have happened in their past. Maybe they were betrayed by someone they liked or loved, or they put their trust in the wrong person. Maybe they faced some kind of injustice or hardship when they were growing up, or if your character's older in the present day, maybe when they were in college or, just at some point in their past. Maybe they were a victim of some kind of crime, or maybe they made some kind of really big mistake, or they failed at something really important. So there's a lot of areas you can mine for a wound, but again, we're just looking for something that happened in the past that caused psychological or emotional pain and created a fear. So a strong belief that that thing could happen again, and a fear that the same thing or something similar will happen. Now, a really good resource for digging into character wounds is a book called The Emotional Wound Thesaurus, A Writer's Guide to Psychological Trauma by Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi, and we will link to that book in the show notes, but this is one of my favorite resources. Even if you don't know what your character's wound is, you can flip through this book and you'll get so many ideas, and then once you land on something, the authors have listed out ways that those types of wounds can impact your character's life in the present and or the future. So it's a really, really great resource. And again, I will link to that in the show notes. But that is your first step, to uncover your character's wound. And we're going to use that as we develop the next two steps. So moving on to step 2, you want to discover your character's inner obstacle. And if we think about what we just did in step 1, we found that wound or that moment that created the wound or that specific fear, right? So when in that vulnerable state from that wounding event, your character is going to try to understand or rationalize that painful experience. And they're going to come up with some kind of false conclusion. So through flawed logic, they're going to reach a conclusion about themselves or the world that is not true. And usually this false belief or this lie or this outdated worldview, it's usually tied to disempowering beliefs that the character is unworthy, incompetent, naive, defective, lacks value, or something like that. And it's this inner obstacle that causes your character to hold back. So it makes it difficult for them to love fully or trust deeply or live a life without reservation, whatever that is in your story. Within your character's arc, this inner obstacle will often clash with your character's effort to achieve their goal because deep down they feel unworthy of it and the happiness that it will bring. And it's only when they're able to shatter their false belief or overcome this internal obstacle that they will truly feel like they deserve the prize they seek and usually get it. So a formula I like to get my creative juices flowing, and a formula that you can borrow, goes something like this. Because of TBD wound, my character believes inner obstacle. So for example, because my character's brand new business idea was stolen by their best friend and now that best friend's a millionaire, that's the wound, right? They believe no one can be trusted. So that's the inner obstacle. Or here's another example. Because my character got tangled in underwater debris and almost drowned, that's the wound, right? That traumatic event. They now believe that the world is too dangerous and the only safe place is in their home. So that is the internal obstacle or that false belief. And hopefully you can see from these examples how that wounding event and the inner obstacle it created can still very much impact your character by the time the story starts on page 1. So what we're really trying to create is not only their backstory, but how their character arc is starting on page 1. So your reader is going to meet your character when they already have this inner obstacle, and we now know that it comes out of this traumatic event or this wounding experience that we fleshed out in step 1. Okay, so that's step 2. We want to discover our character's inner obstacle. Now moving on to step 3. Step 3 is to brainstorm how this will all show up in the present day. And by present day, I mean from page 1 of your story to the end of your story. And like I just kind of hinted at, your character's backstory and this inner obstacle and this wounding event, they can all help you decide how to start and end your story. Because at the beginning of your story, your character is going to be acting and behaving from a place of believing that inner obstacle. And if they don't learn the lesson of the story or they don't, learn that theme, they're not going to get what they want, right? So in order for them to get what they want and to move on and find happiness or succeed or whatever that is, your character will need to dismantle that inner obstacle and basically dampen the effect that wounding event has on their present life. And I will say here, this is not always true for every single story. This is true if you're writing a story with a positive change arc. So if you're writing the kind of story where the protagonist learns a lesson and they grow by the end, even if that growth is painful, you're probably writing a story with a positive change arc, and what I just said will apply. If you're writing a story with a negative change arc, then your character's most likely not learning that lesson. So in that scenario, usually they're doubling down on their inner obstacle or that outdated belief. So just something to keep in mind. But at this stage, you want to use all the information you've already fleshed out to further develop your character's flaws, behaviors, and traits. So you can consider things like, okay, if my character has lived with this specific internal obstacle for this amount of time by the start of page 1, how are they going to act on a daily basis? You can also think about what their emotional armor looks like. So because of that wound and trying to, protect this inner obstacle and not get triggered, what kind of emotional armor did they have to develop? What are some behaviors they've developed based on that inner obstacle and that wound? And what flaws do they have now? So there might be, flaws that came out of this wounding experience, but there also might be some really good things too. So what qualities and flaws do they have now? All of this brainstorming work around your character's wound and internal obstacle can also help inform your plot. So the plot of your story should be constantly challenging your character's internal obstacle. It should force them to choose repeatedly between upholding that flawed belief or clinging to that inner obstacle or finally dismantling it. And each time they fail to change, there should be consequences that further complicate your plot. So this is also where it helps to think of, what are those things that trigger my character's wound or that make them put up that emotional armor? What kinds of events are they not going to want to be in that are actually quite good for them in terms of learning their lesson and growing and changing? Just some things to think about. So that's step 3, just thinking about how the wound and their inner obstacle and their backstory can show up in the present day. And it's not just reminders of how it shows up, right? It's how your character has internalized that wounding event and the fear and the inner obstacle that is birthed from that wounding event and how it shows up in their behavior and their actions. And I think that's a really key piece of the puzzle that writers can dig into a little bit more and use to their benefit. Okay, so I want to look at a case study and I want to talk about the lead male character in the first Bridgerton book, so Mr. Simon Basset. And if we go through those 3 steps, right, the first one is we want to think about what is the traumatic event that created Simon's wound. Well, what we know about Simon is that his mother died in childbirth. And when he was 4, he wasn't able to speak clearly due to a speech impediment. And the Duke, his father, ordered him to get out of his sight, saying that Simon was dead to him. So he was taken in by Lady Danbury and he was able to work on improving his speech, but he was still shunned by his father and talked down to and insulted and things like that every single time he visited. So the traumatic event was that day that, you're dead to me. I wish I never had you. I wish I never met your mother. That whole conversation was the wounding event. And it was further aggravated every time Simon went and visited his father. Now, step 2 is to figure out what kind of internal obstacle or specific fear this traumatic event created. So for Simon, it's one thing to grow up abandoned. It's another thing to know exactly why that person abandoned you and didn't want you, right? And because of Simon's father's hatred and rejection, he grew up believing that he's not worthy of love because he's not perfect. And so because of this, he vows to never marry, swearing that he will never sire an heir, mostly to spite his father. So you can kind of get a sense at this point of how this is going to start impacting the plot, especially because this is a romance story. Okay, so step number 3 is to think about the present day flaws, actions, and behaviors that the traumatic event and that wound and that internal obstacle resulted in. So for Simon, he does not participate in the social season and he travels often to avoid attachment. He's a bit of a rake, but he's still a good guy. He's just not into attachment and doesn't want to get married. Then when he meets the heroine of the story, Daphne Bridgerton, and they enter into a fake relationship, he's forced to ultimately come face to face with the toughest choice of all. So either stick to his vow to spite his father, or he can choose his own version of happiness instead. So that's what the plot forces him to do. And then by the end, he does end up choosing his own happiness. So he has shed that inner obstacle. He's lessened the effect that that traumatic event and that wound has on his life, and he finds happiness because of it. So hopefully you can see how going through those 3 steps or answering those 3 questions can really help you start developing a great backstory for your character. Now, speaking of doing the work to actually develop your character's backstory, something that I like to do for myself and with the writers I work with is to write a scene that, only you're going to see, but it's a scene of that wounding event or that traumatic event happening. So write that out on a page. This can be a really great way to explore a character's past and see them in that context when this wound got created and they developed that specific fear. So this can give you better insight into who they are as a whole person rather than just that version that you've created to serve the story you're telling from page 1 on. You can also kind of work backwards with this. So let's say that you have, some idea of the character that you want to write about in the present day. Start with who they are to you now or who they are from page 1 on and think about what past events might have influenced the way they are today. This will help you create justification for some of your choices, which in turn will start to give you the whole story of that character's experience instead of just what we see from page 1 to the end. So again, there's no right or wrong way or no right or wrong time to develop a character's backstory. It's what works best for you in your process. And, sometimes ideas come to us one way where, let's say, you'll know everything about a character's backstory from the ideation phase. Other times you'll have to go back through and develop or flesh out your character's backstory through revisions. So before I let you go, let's quickly recap what we talked about in today's episode. We talked about what backstory is. So this is everything that happens before the story starts on page 1. And we talked about it being important because it influences everything that happens in your story, from the plot events to your character's motivations to your ability to manage your thematic subtext. So that's key point 1. Key point number 2 is that there are 3 things you'll want to flesh out, or 3 ingredients to properly develop your character's backstory. You'll want to flesh out their wound. So this is an event that causes psychological or emotional pain and gives birth to a very strong belief or fear that it could happen again. So that's ingredient number 1. Ingredient number 2 is their inner obstacle. So this is that outdated worldview or misbelief that's born from that wounding event, and it's what is still impacting your character from the time the story starts on page 1 until they learn that lesson. And then the third thing you'll want to think about is their current behavior and motivations based on that inner obstacle. So how will they behave? How will they make choices and take actions that can show the reader that they're very afraid of this situation coming to pass again? So they don't want to relive that wounding event. They don't want their inner obstacle to prove true. So they have these behaviors and motivations and beliefs that show up in the present day story based on the wound and the inner obstacle and really result in an unmet need. So that's key point number 2, the 3 ingredients you need. And then key point number 3 is actually a recommended exercise. So I recommend writing out the scene from your character's past that caused that wound. So what was that traumatic experience? Write it out as a scene. And it doesn't have to go in your novel or be shared with anybody. It's just for you to really get to know your character outside of the frame that you've built from page 1 to the end. So hopefully you now feel like you are well equipped to develop your character's backstory, and now you have those 3 key ingredients to developing character backstory that you could put in your writing toolbox and hopefully develop stronger, more 3-dimensional characters. So that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in and for showing your support. If you're an Apple user, I'd really appreciate it if you took a few seconds to leave a rating and a review. Your ratings and reviews tell Apple that this is a podcast that's worth listening to. And in turn, your reviews will help get this podcast in front of more fiction writers just like you. As always, I'll be back next week with a brand new episode full of actionable tips, tools, and strategies to help you become a better writer and craft a story you're proud of. Until then, happy writing.